this is Kelly Sadler, and this is this week's Politically Unstable. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Asher, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He also served at the State Department in 2020, tracking down the origins of the COVID-19 virus under Secretary Pompeo. Dr. Asher, thank you so much for joining us this week.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
Well, as you know, on Tuesday, Dr. Fauci went to the Hill and was given some tough questioning by Republican lawmakers as to why did he dismiss the lab leak theory at the get-go? What science was the 6-foot, distancing based on? What science was masking children based on? And he really didn't take any accountability. It seemed to be the CDC's fault. It seemed to be somebody Anderson's fault. He never took firm responsibility for exactly what happened and missteps during the COVID-19 years. I'm sure that you watched the testimony. What were your thoughts on his answers and what seems to be a real lack of accountability for these government officials who made these crucial decisions that so impacted America?
Well, it just was a further demonstration of the gain of dysfunctionality in Washington, D.C. It's either a gain or a game, but it's a gain for those who practice it successfully, like Dr. Fauci, who's one part medical pioneer, one part snake oil salesman, and another part just pure out Washington deep state kleptocrat. Running a bureaucracy that's the largest in the whole U.S. government in terms of grant funding. They're putting out $4 or $5 billion a year. Biodefense is well over half of that. How did he become this biodefense guy and then do nothing with his biodefense billions he's put in? He's actually spent over $38.5 billion on biodefense since 2002, between 2002 and 2022, when he left the National Institutes of Health on so-called biodefense research. It didn't detect COVID. It didn't diagnose COVID. Didn't disrupt COVID. Instead, it became protecting that program became one of the reasons why he strove to assert himself and to cover up his fingerprints and those of his colleagues. And his colleagues include, members of his own inner sanctum, David Morins, who testified, who was his senior advisor. Fauci tried to downplay in the hearing his relationship with Morins. It goes back over, I think, 26 years. He's been the senior advisor. Morins had been the senior advisor to Fauci for, I think, 22 years. I was senior advisor to two secretaries of state. As far as I know, I was the only senior advisor. I actually used to call myself the junior advisor because secretary probably would make fun of me with my fancy title. But I was a senior advisor, and that meant I had direct access to communications involving the secretary. I was in consultation frequently with him and our deputy secretary, Rich Armitage, and then I continued under Connie Rice when I moved over to the counselor's office. But that's all part of the secretary's office, so I know what it's like to be in the inner sanctum of important people. And that continued when I worked at the state under Secretary Pompeo and working in the intelligence world before that. I've never seen behavior like this in my life in Washington. It didn't just start at NIH and NIAID, Fauci's organization. We saw it in the State Department ourselves. We saw it with $100 million plus of USAID funding to Chinese government, which we had no idea for biological research and development. I mean, what is AID doing in this? We could never figure it out. I mean, the Pompeo, he didn't even know about it. I didn't know about it. I mean, and then state was clearing some of my own colleagues and some of the people that reported to Tom DiNanno, who was our assistant secretary, and myself. They kept complaining to us, don't investigate COVID-19 because it's gonna blow back right in our faces. I'm like, why are you saying that? And they said, we can't tell you. It's a Pandora's box. It's a can of worms. I mean, this thing goes beyond Dr. Fauci. It gets into China, the Chinese government, the ambitions of the People's Liberation Army to harness biology, especially synthetic biology, to create superviruses with specific effects ranging from causing severe illness, like we've seen with COVID getting into people's lungs, but reaching also into the neurological domain where COVID's had a much bigger impact than people have really figured out until recently. And I mean, this was we know because I was running the WMD intelligence function at state, which basically the whole government rolls up into that cone. So we're the policy arm of the weapons of mass destruction and countering that. But the intelligence people have to report to us because we compile annual reports on compliance with things like the Biological Weapons Convention. And that was the basis why I started the investigation in the summer of 2020, because we suspected there had been a number of biological weapons related convention violations. So I started investigating the Chinese, and I'd been looking into it since the onset of SARS-CoV-2,
Mm-hmm.
as we saw it in January of 2020. I'd been following the intel because it concerned my office and our mission of countering weapons of mass destruction and trying to control the technology flow related to that. But we weren't looking at the National Institutes of Health in our own government. But we soon started to suspect that the fix was in because, when we received sensitive intelligence briefings, we were getting the same talking points from the intelligence community that were coming straight out of Fauci and his scientific coterie, including the scientists that he brought in beginning of February 2020 to advise him on the nature of COVID-19. And these are the same scientists, of course, as the hearing covered that had repeatedly warned in their initial analysis of the COVID sequence that it looked engineered.
Mm-hmm.
And then, miraculously 3 days later, with no paper trail documenting what changed their analysis, they changed their view. And then, of course, they all received multi-million-dollar NIAID grants in the wake of this. And Fauci says it's outrageous to suggest that there could be some connection. It's outrageous for us to deny that there's a connection. Okay, there's a connection. I've heard this from some of the scientists themselves, actually, believe it or not. They felt threatened if they didn't toe the line. And, he was careful to sort of mask his communications, but he had his staff, his minions, who made it clear that if you wanted to play, and you were going to have to pay up in the form of you wanted him to pay you. You had to play the game of trying to participate really in a COVID cover-up, which to me is about the most reprehensible thing I can imagine, because we really weren't in a position to declare anything in February of 2020 regarding the origin of COVID-19. We knew it was coming from China. We knew the Chinese were covering it up at a level which you've never seen, and I've been covering China for 34 years, literally since I was in college and I had a security clearance doing work for the U.S. State Department. So, I mean, I went through SARS. So no one's going to tell me, since I was a senior advisor for East Asia and Pacific Affairs and one of the point people at state for SARS, largely because I was in Beijing covering that I was part of the North Korea 6-party talks. But I was I was the senior official on duty, basically, and in Beijing when the thing became public in 2003 in January. And so I attended meetings with the Minister of Public Health in China. I attended meetings with the police. I attended lots of meetings with the Foreign Service of the Chinese government. They didn't hide the existence of SARS. They just told us, please don't tell anyone. We want to keep it a state secret. But they didn't hide it from the State Department. They didn't tell us everything they should have, but they didn't just deny its existence. This time they told us absolutely nothing, denied that it really even existed as a threat. And essentially, and then they allowed hundreds of thousands of people to leave China, while at the same time they shut down Wuhan and other cities in intra-Chinese travel. So, what was the Chinese agenda? We certainly considered it hostile from day one that we started in covering the COVID cover-up in Wuhan and in Beijing. But, little did we realize the extent to which it was going on inside our own government. And that's what came out of that hearing yesterday, or at least should have come out in the hearing yesterday.
So why? Sorry to interrupt, but why did Dr. Fauci go to great lengths to promote the wet market theory? Why did he have so much invested, it seems like, in this Eco Health Alliance, which we knew that his department gave grants to, and that they were doing gain of function research
Well,
in
the
China?
$38 billion plus program for biodefense largely involved gain of function and other uh, uh, related genetic alterations of pathogens to make them more transmissible or to cause them to gain a new function, like instead of affecting just your lungs, it could affect your brain or it could affect your central nervous system. I mean, these were functions that were, we believe, based on our scientific analysis, and I had world-class PhD and PhD MDs involved in our effort from the national laboratories, from Fort Detrick, the Army's Biological Defense Command, the National Center for Military Intelligence. People, we had people working for us whose whole life was about biological warfare and dual use capabilities, which, if they got out, could essentially become weaponized. And frankly, almost every scientist in the government that I initially consulted with, and including a few that are veterans, of including a couple Nobel laureates I spoke to, everyone said that they thought the sequence had oddities that looked bioengineered in them. And that's exactly what Fauci's experts told him. And then he panicked, obviously, because that meant that his own program to create and endow these supernatural properties in these viruses via genetic engineering, including funding millions and millions of dollars of research in China, most specifically in Wuhan, but also at other labs that we know to be affiliated with the Chinese military, such as the Harbin Veterinary Research Institute in northern China, which is the largest animal related biological experimentation center in the world. The U.S. government was funding these programs in China that were being run by the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and we didn't even know who they were. And what came out yesterday is that Fauci basically admitted he had no idea what was happening in Wuhan. He had no idea who these Chinese scientists were. They have no oversight and accountability. It's outrageous inside the entire public health bureaucracy in our U.S. government, where, like, the military calls it the self-licking ice cream cone. I've never quite figured out how that works, but it's what we do know is it's a feeding frenzy where people become a part of this dangerous research sort of syndicate or mafia, and then they run into limitations, for example, with doing certain types of experiments in the United States due to the framework that Fauci himself was involved in passing, this PC30 framework on restricting gain of function research. So they just did what Fauci said. He said they'd rather have it happen in Wuhan than Hoboken. So they farmed it out to Wuhan. And then the Chinese started to use it for their own malicious purposes to develop dual use research capabilities that one of which unfortunately leaked from a laboratory where it had been essentially synthetically developed. That's what came out of our State Department intelligence community-wide investigation, was the degree to which the gain of function wasn't just involving injecting animals with each other's blood and things to try to passage and create a sort of natural like transmission where you could simulate natural exposure to different pathogens interspecies. They were altering the genetics of the sequence, and then they were testing the newly created, we'll call it COVID-19, which was created well before it leaked, we believe, and somehow or another, in the context of lab testing and potentially the development of a vaccine, which we would consider an antidote in the world of biological warfare, they leaked it. And I don't think it was, I do not believe, based on everything we've seen, it was deliberate. But the cover up was systematic and deliberate, and it went all the way up to the level of Xi Jinping. And Fauci didn't know a damn thing about this. What's amazing is here's this guy who's getting paid, much more than the president of the United States, because he has two jobs, one of which is NIAID director, the other one is biodefense czar. And he doesn't even study the intelligence on what our adversaries are doing, what their capabilities are, what their intent is, what their ambitions are. And he ends up funding it, which is, frankly, I'll say batshit crazy in my experience. mean, I'm sorry to speak like that, but it's outrageous, it's ridiculous, and now in some ways, I don't say that Fauci's got 27 million dead people around the world's blood on his hands, because that's what the excess mortality statistics show has occurred since the outset of COVID 4 years ago. But he contributed to it and materially, and then he helped orchestrate, ironically, with the Chinese, not necessarily in direct cooperation, but for his own motives. He created a sort of Wuhan gate, we'll call it, where he steered the narrative away from a potential lab a leak as an origin, because it would imply that his funding was in the middle of that.
So I have a question now.
Okay.
COVID-19 is in the rear view mirror for a lot of Americans, but this biodefense, this gain of function research continues. And I understand
Mhm.
why the U.S. Defense Department, why the Intelligence Department would want to have our own capabilities to combat if a pandemic like this is released, or to have an antidote. But I mean, the fact that they were doing it in China in conjunction with the PLA, one of our major adversaries, is a huge problem. So my question to you is this gain of function research continuing in China? Is the U.S. still giving grants for this research in foreign countries? Or
Yes.
it, wow. And how does that
Absolutely.
stop?
Absolutely. Well, because a lot of it goes to universities to begin with, which was the largest conduit. So the money that went directly from like this Eco Health Alliance, which was sort of an aggregator, I'll call it, as of funding for bat-related coronavirus research, particularly, it was their main focus, not their only focus. They sort of consolidated it, and then they became a funding bridge for NIAID, Fauci's outfit, and for other parts of the U.S. government, including the Department of Defense, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which people joked became the Defense Threat Conduction Agency because it was providing so much funding to the Chinese for so-called capacity building. I mean, the Chinese, why are we funding DoD funding capacity building in China for biodefense? I mean, we by the way, we don't really know much about biodefense in China. Those of us who've studied China's WMD programs, it's basically biooffense. And the only defense aspects that are significant relate to creating vaccines that are idiosyncratic to specific, very dangerous viral vectors that they develop, like COVID-19. So, there's how NIH and HHS were oblivious to this information. I can't explain it. I mean, the French that built the BSL-4 lab, the highly dangerous the lab where were supposed to do this type of research, were kicked out in 2017. They are upstanding people. They warned the U.S. government that they suspected there could be a WMD-related program at the Wuhan Institute, just based on the fact that they had built this ultra-sophisticated lab that can be used for developing the most dangerous pathogens on the face of the earth for biological warfare. And then they were supposed to be the adults in the room and train the Chinese on how to use the lab. They were evicted. There were supposed to be 50 French scientists there. Not one ever made it. So, I mean, to at least to operate the BSL-4 lab in partnership with the Chinese. Instead, the People's Liberation Army took over. This was not some secret to those of us in the government. I mean, people keep saying, oh, you have to have access to all the secret information. I mean, the fact that the French were kicked out was in the French media. It was on the cover of Le Monde newspaper. I mean, some of us can read French. I mean, is it that hard? And by the way, the fact that the Chinese were conducting PLA classified research, we figured it out conclusively based on their unclassified website in Chinese, which we downloaded in January 2020, when we first started hearing rumors from Chinese sources, not CIA, not intelligence sources, State Department. We have thousands and thousands of people we talk to every week in places like China, at least hundreds, I'll say, thousands every month. And these are confidential sources, including Chinese government officials. And we heard from them that they felt that there was sort of like some sort of biological Chernobyl meltdown occurring in Wuhan, starting in the late fall of 2019. We just didn't know what it was. We saw a huge spike in influenza reported in the Chinese statistics. So we assumed it was some sort of super flu, maybe even H5N1 or something like that, which is an avian flu. We didn't know what it was. We knew the Chinese were in a panic at the center of their Chinese government. So, we may not know what's always going on inside their conversations, but when you could use advertising technology, putting aside any classified means, and you could observe, which we did, that there was a massive uptick in IMSI activity, which is the thing that, when you use a phone, that identifies the phone. That information's unclassified, and you can buy it you can buy it. It's gotten some controversy because the intelligence community's been buying so-called ad tech as the type of surveillance. It's sort of this warrantless wiretap related stuff, but it's not wiretaps. It's literally the same stuff that Procter and Gamble, when they're, and Costco, and when you're shopping, in a Chinese supermarket, especially a mega market, including ones operated by U.S. firms like Costco, I hate to tell you, whether it's Google or the people that make your phone, they're going to know what you're doing, and they're going to sell that data to Tide detergent or something, so that they can track the people buying Tide. That same technology can be used, and this was revealed in the Wall Street Journal. I had nothing to do with it, to have been used to target communications activity between Wuhan and Beijing. And according to the Wall Street Journal article, not me, I'm just going to say that there was a huge uptick in high-level communications activity that was suggestive of some sort of crisis. So, frankly, when I started looking at this in the fall of 2019, not knowing anything about COVID-19 or the research they were doing, I was working primarily on nuclear weapons involving China and preparedness for war. And we were worried that they were getting ready for some sort of attack on Taiwan, because we saw such a huge surge in activity, but we didn't know what it was for. So we assumed the worst, that they were planning some military attack on Taiwan or doing something even against the United States. Instead, it was them responding, the Chinese leadership, to this massive crisis that was emerging as their own sort of Keystone Cops operation in Wuhan allowed a hyper dangerous coronavirus variant, which they had developed, called COVID-19. There were others, by the way, that managed to escape. And then I think that they tried to cover this, to stop it. They tried to cover it up. They rushed a vaccine into research. That's all based on public patent filings in China. But it appears that the vaccine failed. And that also popped up briefly in the hearing yesterday, that the individual that did the vaccine development, who was a major general in the People's Liberation Army, an individual named Dr. Zhou Yusen, or Major General Dr. Zhou Yusen, that his vaccine program apparently had a flaw in it. And there was a suspicion that it actually spread COVID-19. We don't know, that they actually did an insufficiently attenuated vaccine. This is when they were potentially doing live vaccine, like, with the measles, or, we get with the flu. It's a live attenuated vaccine. So you actually get the flu, and then your body creates antibodies and responds to it. That's a traditional vaccine. I frankly don't know the details of what they were doing, or Dr. Zhou was doing. We know this about Dr. Zhou, and it came out yesterday. Two things that were fascinating. He died when he jumped or was pushed off the top of the Wuhan Institute in May of 2020. We've heard from family members of him that he was pushed. Very strange for a major general in the Chinese military to be a bit more or less executed by being thrown off the top of a building where he'd been working. But what was also amazing is that Dr. Fauci funded 2 and maybe 3 of the grants that he used to develop vaccine technology. So he's the head guy for basically creating antidotes to potential pandemic pathogens that could be used to destroy state and society among foreign adversaries like us. And Fauci was funding that research too. So it wasn't just funding the creation of COVID-19 through gain of function. He was funding the research to supposedly, create a vaccine that could be applied to COVID-19. I mean, the vaccine research we know he funded actually involved MERS and Ebola, far more dangerous, far. But the idea that we need to give money to the Chinese to fund their development of things which could provide a vaccine, which would allow them to attack us and then protect their own population at the same time because they could be vaccinated, It's preposterous. It's material support to an adversary. It's almost as bad as material support to terrorists, because I've been involved in that world, as you know. I mean, I've never seen something more criminal, frankly, in my entire life. And the cover up is Watergate times 1,000. I mean, this is we've covering up something that led to the deaths of millions of people and the disruption of, like, our life. And we lost, I calculate, because I have an economics background too. I've done some analysis. My calculation is we lost roughly 60% of GDP between the fiscal stimulus to offset the COVID and the monetary stimulus, which had produced the inflation, which is still hanging around today. I mean, the damage that these people did and their lack of accountability, including Dr. Fauci's organization. What needs to happen, and we'll see if this happens if President Trump gets reelected. So there's got to be a recovery of accountability, responsibility,
Yeah.
and people being, forced to tell the truth in Washington, D.C. Because right now, when Tony's lips are moving, he's lying, in my mind.
So, this is staggering information, but by the end of 2020, during the transition, I mean, a lot of this information had been amassed by your investigation,
Yeah.
and presumably was handed off to the incoming Biden administration.
Yes.
Um,
And they refused to even be briefed. They didn't even want they plugged their ears. They did receive the classified and unclassified reports and briefings. We had very extensive documentation. Um, but we had begun at the end of the Trump administration to declassify sensitive intelligence that was specific to the COVID origin story. Only about 10% of the intelligence that I'm aware of was ever declassified. We managed to get 10% roughly in the form of a few sensitive reports that were then downgraded to unclassified by the DNI Director Ratcliffe, who did a great job, and Secretary Pompeo. It was the two of them basically doing staff work themselves, because we tried to do this ourselves with the IC, the intelligence community, and they stonewalled it. But we managed to sort of steamroll it at the end of the Trump administration. But the reality is, many of the most explosive aspects of the origin story are still being
what's
withheld
even more
from
insidious
analysis.
about all of this is that press organizations and senators and doctors who were questioning this Fauci narrative the entire time were censored by Meta, by Facebook, by Twitter. We were put in basically jail for questioning the narrative that the government at the time, and Biden kept Fauci as his top doc up until.
Of course, he actually promoted him in effect to be the chief scientist to the president. He was promoted, so he was rewarded, and that seems to be the Democratic game here. Democrats, I can't understand it. This is a bipartisan disaster for the world. It's not. I've never. I mean, I've been, a congressional staffer many years ago when we did the Republican Revolution, the Contract with America, and I've been through, internecine politics on Capitol Hill. I just can't even imagine that we would not want an objective rendering of the truth to emerge to the best of our knowledge. But the cover up continues from the very top, and it's largely to protect Tony Fauci's aura, I guess we'll call it. It doesn't seem to be to protect anybody else. It's not protecting the public health. I mean, and by the way, COVID is still out there. Okay. And one thing, all I say, I just had lunch with one of the world experts on vaccination. And I mean, I'm not here as a MD, I'm a PhD, and I'm a social scientist, not a doctor of medicine. But certainly, I mean, I think that there's a strong basis that the mRNA vaccines, despite downsides, did provide a lot of protection. And it was a bloody miracle that we managed to develop them. But the people that did that were largely almost punished. It's incredible. I mean, the people that developed this, the most important one was Dr. Robert Cadlick, who was the Assistant Secretary for Pandemic Preparedness. Dr. Cadlick in 2018 led the development of a national biodefense strategy that's available on the web. It's a very interesting document to read. And it starts off with the premise that there's two potential pathways for a pandemic to emerge in the United States in the future. Number one is natural born evolution of a virus cross species. Number two is a lab leak. Okay, they were equally weighted. And what was supposed to happen and this was a policy that President Trump signed, and I still wonder why he didn't force people to follow it. But I think a lot of us, he's being told we don't need to follow it because we know where this thing came from. It was conclusively coming from nature. So we didn't need to probe the supernatural or non-natural origin story because we'd already settled that. We hadn't settled anything. I mean, when the COVID cover-up began with Dr. Fauci in the chair, at the beginning of February 2020, we did not have those answers, but his own scientific advisors, as has came out in the even in Fauci's own interviews, they warned him that there was a higher than not chance that this thing was at least in part synthetically altered. And that was one of the reasons why it was so much different than SARS. I mean, SARS kills 800 people, got 8,000 people roughly sick. This thing's, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times worse than that. So they're not even in the same real ballpark. So obviously something different has to account scientifically for the difference between this and SARS. And the fact that Dr. Cadlick, we used to call him the Dr. Bobs because there was Dr. Robert Redfield and Dr. Robert Cadlick, both of whom have spent their entire careers working on biodefense for the U.S. government. Redfield's a virologist. He's the head of something called the Center for Disease Control at the time. They're the ones that were supposed to be in charge of pandemic response, not, them and the folks developing the vaccine, which would have been Cadlick, both of whom have military esteemed careers and intelligence backgrounds and worked in biological defense labs, okay, where they, developed, the likes of COVID-19, but in the highest lab security circumstances to try to see what an adversary could do to kill us. And then they promptly destroyed what they developed. But they did, our government does work to develop these things, but not for offense ever. It's always just to see what someone could do. But today, you don't need Fort Detrick. You don't need DARPA. You don't need DOD money. You can just go to NIAID and you could literally, if you got a grant, you could just order up what's called oligonucleotides, which you can print the DNA on, and you could create SARS, or COVID 2025 in your basement if you were a talented enough researcher. The stuff's available online. You can buy it. You have to know something about biochemistry. My daughter was doing CRISPR research on frog genetics as a senior in high school in AP biology, where she altered some aspect of a frog's DNA. I don't even know, something with its feet or something. But I mean, the point is, of course, the technology is proliferating, but instead of trying to get a lid on that and know, as Fauci would, that technology had proliferated, that he had funded the proliferation of it, and that it could easily be used against us, and it could be, and you could create a bio weapon or a bio capability in a lab, and if you let it out and you covered it up, it would become weaponized. He knew the whole story. And so what he did, rather than confront that narrative, he confounded that narrative. So whenever Bob Redfield, who you've seen on TV, it was the beard, wonderful man, a great guy, and an absolutely honest individual in my experience, straight shooter. He looked at this from the so-called etiology of the disease, the way it spread. There was no animal host that we saw. You didn't even see COVID-19 in bats. The only time it got into animals was when it was transmitted from humans to animals. So it obviously was optimized to human transmission from day one, and it spread pretty much like wildfire from day one. And the thing about COVID-19 that makes it a more pernicious weapon, believe it or not, is it doesn't kill everybody. It just makes people very sick. And so, the latest area of research related to COVID-19 is in the fact that the Chinese were doing research on the neurological side of it, which I'll let Dr. Cadlick explain if you ever get a chance to interview him. But, Dr. Cadlick went on to lead the investigation into COVID-19 origin for the Senate Health Committee, which handles public health in the Senate. And his report indicated pretty much what my report indicated, that the Chinese had developed this among a number of other strains of coronaviruses for purposes that were specific to the demands of the People's Liberation Army. Biodefense, biooffense, we don't know, but that those were extremely dangerous variants of everything from Ebola, which is like 80% fatal, I believe, to MERS, that's just 35 to 50%, to SARS, and SARS-CoV-2, which is, we'll say, 0.5 to 1%, depending on the age of the population, and lower, of course, for much younger people. But even with young people, we're finding that there are after effects. The number of girls, my daughter included, have developed something called POTS, which is a syndrome related to your heart and your neurological system that causes unstable heartbeats and, I think, arrhythmias, and you go from very low to very high blood pressure. It can be fatal under some circumstances, and certainly can cause people just to pass out. Athletes and such are getting it, but the number of people in the United States, young people particularly, that have POTS today is like, I think it's gone up by like 10x since COVID. So even we still don't even know the full depths of what this bioweapon, in my mind, can do and will do to our population in the future. Putting aside the dangers of some of the vaccines, which we know about, but I mean, all I've learned is, I'm not an anti-vaxxer because, it takes synthetic biology, which is mRNA, to defeat synthetic biology, which is COVID-19. I mean, it's unfortunate. None of it's safe exactly, but the goals the Chinese had, which was now where we're trying to go, is trying to assess what were they trying to achieve, and a lot of it's available in their own publications. They've been talking about biological strike mechanisms in the PLA's public doctrinal publications for years. We just didn't take it that seriously.
So what needs to be done? Let's say Donald Trump does win the election. What needs to be done to clean up this mess, to both shed sunlight on it, as well as make sure that a weapon like this is never used on the U.S. population again?
Well, I think the most important thing on day one is the ban gain of function research entirely, outside of cancer and other type of therapeutic development for things which they don't spread like viruses. Okay, so that, number one, stop doing potential harm to ourselves and to the world. Have a review commission just on that, and stop providing loophole after loophole, which is all that Fauci did. He 99% of the gain of function research that they were supposed to oversee and review escapes the definition that Dr. Fauci proposes for gain of function research. So he created this ridiculous definition of what constitutes gain of function that nobody even understands what the hell he says. Okay, even people that studied mathematics don't understand what one log difference is, because we know what a log is, but it's off what the base is. So it's an arbitrary, ridiculous definition designed to facilitate gain of function research, not contain it. So secondly, that needs to be banned. Secondly, we should ban, I believe, science technology with cooperation with China. There's no good that's coming from it. I've looked at this. My staff has looked into it here at the Hudson Institute. Maybe we'll find some exceptions to that rule, but I can't find any good reason for us to be funding the Chinese doing anything, because every program we fund, they're either stealing our IP, as everybody knows, intellectual property. They're trying to recruit our personnel through the 1,000 Talents program and other intelligence-related programs, which the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party back, and they target. And we've had thousands of American scientists, and not just the head of the chemistry department at Harvard, who received essentially payoffs related to it, fall into this program. Do you realize that NIH on its website, even today, has an advertisement for if you want to join the 1,000 Talents program, who to call and how to apply? So they're advertising the Communist Party subversion program. Great job. That's great to do. So we need to enforce a ban basically on science technology cooperation with China. I'm sorry for the scientists that think that Chinese are good scientists. They may be very good scientists, but they're not good intentioned because their government's not intentioned. It's like saying we should be cooperating with the Iranians on nuclear weapons. I mean, seriously, it's madness. So, and then we need to have a true COVID-19 commission that makes the 9/11 commission look minor league. I mean, we need to get to the bottom of what happened, how we were involved. Why didn't we know? The intelligence failure alone is the largest in history, much larger than Pearl Harbor. You can read a book that was written by Roberta Wallstetter years ago about the early warning that the likes of Franklin Roosevelt and others had through signals intelligence about the Japanese plans to attack Pearl Harbor. I think the fact is, much like before 9/11, we were aware that Al-Qaeda was plotting to attack in Asia. We just never thought they were going to attack in the United States. We should have, because they had done it before in 1993 with Ramzi Yousef. But we just didn't think of it. I was part of that. I admit error. I testified before the 9/11 Commission in the classified setting about what we knew. We tried to take measures to stop 9/11 from happening or a terrorist attack, but we failed. But the intelligence community, ironically, just like we learned at State, had information that was dispositive about the origin of COVID-19, which they didn't process. So they had information on the hijackers in Arizona, getting flight schools and all that stuff. It wasn't reported out widely. It was kept in extremely restricted channels. We need to understand that our biointelligence absolutely has to be improved. We need to develop secret sources and methods to collect intelligence against our adversaries' programs, but we first need to stop ourselves from being the biggest material supporter of our own adversaries. So that's my short list of candidates of things I would do. I'm more than happy to help the Trump administration draft a series of executive orders that would facilitate this, and those should be put forward at the beginning of administration. Trump talks about, I've heard from the campaign people, 200 to 300 EOs or executive orders on day one. Hey, I'm all for it, but make sure you understand, it's not just about firing people and Schedule Fs and all this. We've got to create a better control system in our own government, and then we have to create better intelligence and early warning, because somebody else is going to do this. It may not be the Chinese. It could be the Chinese. And then, I'm all for, frankly, and I know this is more controversial, I think we need to continue with vaccine development programs, hopefully improving the safety and soundness so we're not using experimental vaccines. But I'm glad that, and it wasn't Tony Fauci. Fauci was claiming credit in his testimony for creating mRNA. That's nuts. DARPA funded the original research. A lot of credit MIT when I was at MIT in the 1990s, so I was there at Lincoln Laboratories, not as a medical doctor, but working as part of a team looking at different biotechnologies which could be used as weapons. By the way, mRNA could be used as a weapons attack capability. I'm not going to tell you how. I don't think I could, but I wouldn't. But the point is, it is dangerous, but it also has huge life-saving properties. So we need to create a reservoir of capabilities, which is really what Fauci was supposed to be funding with his biodefense money. Instead, he's funding all these ridiculous, dangerous experiments. The stuff that he should have been funding, and he did provide a lot of money after COVID-19 emerged. But that was all part of his goal of scrambling to the top of the heap to be put in charge of the presidential response. Because, he wanted to be the man at the center because he wanted to protect himself, not just protect the American people. I'm convinced of that. His own personal sense of biosecurity personally, even though his own personal security seems threatened, seemed to rank paramount in his mind, as far as I can tell, because he marginalized Dr. Cadlick. He marginalized Dr. Redfield. These are the guys who'd spent their whole careers preparing for the big day. The big day happened. The strategy they developed was abandoned. Fauci comes up with this hobnob sort of skip-scotch, lack of, there was no real clear strategy. Thank God Cadlick it turned to vaccine development and got the mRNA vaccine developed by the end of 2020, which is a miracle. But the reality is this. We know the Chinese were working on this thing before it broke out. We know partly from their own patent filings, by the way. It's not all like classified stuff I can't talk about. They were doing patent filings related to a vaccine for coronavirus 19, a virus that looked like it at least. There were patents being filed in the fall of 2019 for that. There were patents being filed at the immediate outset of COVID-19 for remdesivir, which was never, the Chinese didn't have the right to patent it. It wasn't developed by them. It was developed by, U.S. Drug companies. So, the Chinese knew from day one pretty much, And I'd say day one being mid-November 2019, what they were dealing with. And there is decent information that points to the disease having started before that. So their cover-up could have started as early as September of 2019, when the infamous database of all the viruses that the Wuhan Institute had collected suddenly went offline. It's possible they had an accident then. They tried to contain it. They thought it was successful. It then reemerged. This does happen. Perhaps because of the vaccine, they rushed the vaccine in development because they were panicked that this thing that they had created had gotten into their lab workforce. They were creating the vaccine initially for the lab workforce itself, because it was like to protect them and stop this thing from potentially spreading. It's possible that that vaccine actually spread it. Okay, we don't know that. It's speculation, but we should darn well know what happened, because the sequence of events is, I mean, this is the largest disaster in human history, really, if you think about it. I mean, because it was preventable. Okay, it was detectable, it was preventable, and we were part of it. And we need to face that guilt, and people need to be held accountable. And so, the gain of dysfunction,
Well,
gain in
thank you
Washington
so
has to
much.
stop.
You've given
That's
us
my
a
bottom line.
lot to chew on here, and the next administration a lot to tackle, so that something like this doesn't happen again in the future. But Dr. Asher, I appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you so much.